Here is the long-awaited video lecture. I apologize for this being up so late today. I worked on it most of the day, but had some other computer issues and internet issues come up that kept me from doing almost anything except dealing with those particular issues. Anyway, but I'm back in business now. Uh, 2 chapters this week, Grounded Theory and Ethnographies or Ethnographic Research. We are going to cover just some of the highlights because I think, again, the text does a really good job of explaining pretty much everything. But there are a couple things that I want to highlight. The objectives of the Grounded Theory chapter is to understand what it is, understand when to use it, what are the key elements, how do you do it, and then really how do you evaluate whether or not grounded theory stuff you're reading is any good. So when we think about what grounded theory is, it is this idea that you take your field notes, make your observations, look at a bunch of artifacts, and you try to piece together a story, right? You prepare, collect data, analyze, extract meaning, and develop a theory out of it. But the idea is that you listen to what the data says rather than trying to impose a theoretical framework on it. So you're not looking at it through some theory of addiction or stress or behavior management. You are just looking to see what is going on, what are the common themes that are emerging. And so it's very grassroots, something that's called a bottom-up process rather than a top-down process. So when do you use it? You use it when you need to generate a theory, right? No theories that you see out there are working for you, so you need to figure out what's going on because the existing theories don't give you a good enough explanation. If you want to explain different processes, actions, or interactions, or anything really, you can use grounded theory research again in the absence of other theories. You use it when you want to keep close to the data and not let other, blinders of theories get in your way. And when existing theories just don't cut the mustard, right? And then you need to figure out what the essence or elements of a group, event, or a culture are. When we think about the systematic design, we think about all this coding. And I threw in Vivo in here because it just fits better with the rest of them. Open coding, axial coding, selective coding. I don't think that these are things that need a ton of extra explanation. We've talked about coding in the past, and it's, I think, pretty straightforward. Basically, you are looking for commonalities. When we talk about this idea of finding a core category and thinking of the different causal connections and the context and what the intervening conditions are and all this stuff within this model, right? I think that the text does a nice job of giving you a concrete example to work through. But the idea, right, is that this is really no different than things we've talked about before. It just puts a specific name or title or process on it. Right? When you are trying to figure out what's going on, of course you're going to think about the context, and you are going to think about the different actions or interactions that are coming from this core phenomenon, whatever it is, whether it's student misbehavior, relapse behavior, stress management, PTSD, whatever this core category behavior observation is, right? You want to know what it's predicting, what's causing it, what's leading up to it, how to interpret it, and so on. And this is just a nice framework, or a strategy, I should say, for breaking things down. Again, they do a nice job here. If we keep going, right, with the different types, there is the emerging design, where things are very much more tied to the data itself. One of the things I wanted to make a little clear here is that when we're talking about the different criteria, they mention 4 for this type of grounded theory design. The fit means just that really whatever theory you generate, it really needs to match up with all your data. If you have a bunch of counterexamples in there that don't really fit what you're saying, um, then you really need to review your grounded theory. So, right, you can think of why people relapse for existence, or what causes the difficulty in coping with PTSD or anything like that, right? You might come up with a theory, but if there within your data set are a bunch of counterexamples where your theory doesn't predict anything or doesn't explain anything, well, then you need to kind of dig in deeper. Now, the second thing is that the theory needs to work. And what that means is that you get some explanatory and predictive power out of it, right? It's not really like hypothesis testing, but it kind of is in a non-scientific way, right? You should see how different items or concepts relate. It should predict different types of behavior. It should explain different types of behavior. And if it doesn't, well, then the theory doesn't work. And, right, your theory is no good. Um, if, as the authors say, it works, it will be relevant because it will have some explanatory and predictive power. But the final thing is that it must be modifiable, meaning that you can't just have a theory and say, well, this is how it is for everybody all the time, right? It has to be open to change, new data coming in, new observations being made, and new adaptations to the theory. Not only that, but as the world changes, right, theories also need to change to explain human behavior within the context of new developments. We've been thinking a lot about how the internet and social media and everything affect us, and that was not a real thing, 20, 30 years ago. Um, and so when you think about any theories that predicted social interactions or life satisfaction prior to social networking or social technology, um, you really had a different kind of theory that would need to be adapted to the changing environment. Finally, there is the constructivist design. And one thing I wanted to point out here is what positivist and postmodern really are all about. I don't know if these are common terms, maybe they are, but at least how I always understood them. Positivist means that science is good, scientific principle, and explanatory power is what we want to achieve, right? And if you have a good model for prediction and control, that's great. You assume all these different things are good, you assume some other things are bad, and we all just kind of buy into it. The postmodern perspective is that values and goals that have been kind of historically understood are basically meaningless, and you really need to move beyond them. They're all just constructions and conventions, and they don't really have any absolute truth in anything. And so the constructivist design here is between these two, right? You're not going to throw out everything, but you're not going to blindly accept everything either. So when we think about what theorists do, they really stay, again, grounded in the moment and in their experience. But they're really focused on interpreting that as a construction of the problem they're investigating, of the environment, of the interpersonal relations, right? And so the study will mention the beliefs and values of the researcher, and tries to stay away from any kind of predetermined categories. Again, that's why it's a grounded theory approach. The narrative in this case is much more explanatory, um, and really goes after the assumptions that we have, uh, and what it all means for everybody involved, right? And so when we question things about our religious foundations and our gender identities and things like that, right? Or, kind of feminist power dynamics, um, that's when you get into this kind of gray area where everything's not everything's up for grabs, but things are up for grabs. But you're not going to go totally postmodern and say that nothing is real at all, right? You're going to keep kind of one foot in realism and one foot in abstractism. I don't know if that's even a word, but that gets across the idea. So key characteristics of grounded theory designs. I think they do a great job. I'm not really going to go over these. Evaluating a grounded theory study, right? There are these different criteria. We're going to come back to these later on. I have a little task for you to do. And then when we get to ethnographic research, right? Ethnographic designs are really where you are trying to identify a group of people that could be held together by almost anything. But it's this shared pattern of behaviors, beliefs, and language that develops, right? I also want to emphasize that when we talk about these different types of qualitative research, we're not talking about mutually exclusive categories. We are really just trying to describe qualitative research that serves different goals. So like the idea behind grounded theory is that you don't want to use theoretical frameworks. You want to just kind of stick to the data and see what comes bottom up, grassroots style. Ethnographies, on the other hand, are really about focusing on any qualitative study that focuses on trying to describe or analyze a culture or event like, I don't know, Burning Man or something like that, and the people who go to Burning Man, or any group of people. Ethnographies can employ grounded theory strategies, but they don't have to. Grounded theory studies can be ethnographies, but they don't have to be, right? So there's some overlap, but they don't have to. You do ethnographic stuff when you want to figure out what's going on with a group of people to understand a larger idea, right? I mean, if you just want to study a group of people or do an autoethnography and like a self-study, this is my experience as, a white male from a small Midwestern town that was very religious, right? I can tell that story, but unless I connect it to a larger issue, it's kind of pointless, right? So anybody can tell their life story, but if you can see how it connects theoretically with other things, then it can become good research. When we think of the different types, there's the realist, and I don't think that that needs much explanation. There's the case study, and there's different types of case study. And again, the case study is a commonly used term, and I don't think we need to go into that a lot. I do want to make sure you differentiate and understand the difference between the intrinsic case study that's just an interesting or unusual case, instrumental case study that might not be that unusual, but you're just focusing on one because it helps explain a broader issue, or a collective case study where you are looking at several different cases all together that explain some kind of issue. Again, I think that the author does a great job of talking this through, but if you have any questions, let me know. A critical ethnography will be when you have an agenda, basically, right? Typically, they focus and center around social power or social constructs of power, social justice, and equity. And you are basically trying to advocate or improve the conditions of a particular group. Couple elements, right? One is that you have this idea of reflexivity, which we'll get to a little bit later, basically talking about how you interact with the research and affect the process. But I don't really think that, again, this needs a ton of extra description. Don't need to focus on it. When we think of characteristics, I think, again, they do a pretty good job going through these different things, what cultural themes are, right? When we talk about culture sharing, when we talk, and again, we can talk about anything or all of these things. We can talk about shared patterns, and the three things kind of go together, right? You have your cultural theme, you have this culture sharing, shared patterns of all those things. You have the idea of fieldwork. Make sure you know the difference between the different types of data that you can acquire. And really what fieldwork is, right? But I think that we've gone over this and everybody's on board. When we talk about other key characteristics of descriptions, themes, and interpretations, we also talked about what these things are. Again, right? Descriptions in your field notes, themes that emerge based on your coding. The idea of interpretation is really all about what it means in a broader sense, right? Generating meaning out of the observations. Context or setting, I think that we've talked about before, and I think that is pretty plain. Again, this idea of reflexivity, make sure that if you are going to do an ethnography, that you do not assume that you don't affect things, right? Your presence matters. And this is what we call different threats to validity, right? When we talk about empirical research or objective research, quantitative research. When we talk about experimenter effects, right? The researcher, if they act differently, changes the behavior of the participants, whether they're just reading a script, guiding them through a process, giving them a pill, or conducting an interview. And this gets at that same idea that you need to be aware that because you are going to be embedded in a very personal part and sharing a bunch of lives and sharing experiences, that you are also going to influence those experiences. So it's a really important idea to remember. When we talk about potential ethical issues, right, you're kind of getting very familiar with people, so you need to be clear about what the benefits are, what you're actually doing, your purposes, your end goals, what you're going to produce, what you're going to report, how you're going to handle anonymity, right? And you need to still benefit everybody. This idea of giving back to participants, but also you need to, the whole time, even from day one when you're conceiving the idea, realize what might happen to the people if you actually do this report, right? And so you can think of some 2020 investigations, right? Kind of along those lines. Usually that's different. You're not necessarily trying to benefit the people, but even when you report on somebody's situation and say, like we're talking about Aaliyah's, use of marijuana as a coping strategy. If I do that research, I might be shining a light on a large amount of drug usage that might have negative consequences, even though I'm trying to do something good and help people understand and help people cope. And so I always have to think about what my reporting and releasing of information is going to do. And then we have the evaluation framework here as well. And the graphic in the textbook does a much better job of giving examples here and differentiating between poor and high quality. Which brings us then to the task. And hold on. Here we go. I just need to squeeze it in here. So qualitative research evaluation, right? I'm going to send you an article about bullying, and I want you to answer these questions and ultimately come up with a decision as to whether or not it is any good. Trying to get it up here. There we go. So overall quality, I just want you to circle this. Not a lot of writing in this thing. It will really be just answering yes or no questions, reading through, trying to figure out what type of theory it is, what type of, if it's an ethnography, what kind, again, it can be both. And going through basically the different types of evaluation that he mentions in these chapters, but also like this other one, data validation, does it occur? We've mentioned that before when we talked about qualitative research. And then based on all that, I just want you to tell me whether you think it's poor, moderate, or high quality. And that's it. So if you have any questions on any of the topics or anything in the quiz, let me know. If you are doing or thinking about doing a qualitative research project and think one of these theoretical perspectives or approaches works for you, let me know and we can try to modify your proposal accordingly. Okay, I hope you're all having a good week, and stay tuned for some more feedback on lit reviews and methodologies. I'm going to be assigning the analysis plan later in the week as well. All right, bye-bye.